the internet had both become this incredible sort of engine of how the world went around, but also how it become the place where bad guys do stuff, be it nation states stealing secrets or cyber criminals stealing money. And the thing that strikes me is how these fraud guys are, they have deep understanding of how to mess with humans. Cyber guys have deep understanding typically in how to mess with computers. And, some of the best cyber guys that, sort of hackers that you meet are actually pretty good social engineers at the same time. Very few things are truly unknown. So I think really our sort of idea here is that observe the world at every level. Observe what's happening to the neighbors. That's sort of the most simple sort of thing, all the way down to observe what happens in the net flow.
Today, we're joined by Christopher Ahlberg, CEO and co-founder of Recorded Future, the world's largest threat intelligence company. A serial entrepreneur, Christopher also founded Spotfire, which he successfully exited, along with Recorded Future, just recently to Mastercard. He spent decades at the intersection of data visualization, threat intelligence, and enterprise security, and it's an honor to have him on the show. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here, and I'm sure we're going to have a fun conversation. So excited.
Yeah, me too. So, well, let's start with kind of simple things like your cybersecurity journey. I don't know how you went from Spotfire to Recorded Futures, but I'm sure it's an interesting story there.
Yeah, no, it's maybe it's a little bit different, than maybe some other people. I'm not your classic bits and bytes security. I was not a hacker when I was a kid or that sort of stuff. I'm more of a computer scientist by background, came back and did a PhD in data visualization, data analysis. That's sort of the background I came from, and built this first company called Spotfire that was all about visualizing large data sets. We did a lot of work in intelligence, but that was sort of at the time of call it global war on terror, whatever you want to call it. But, where a lot of people are trying to track bad guys in all kinds of different ways with interesting data sets. We weren't working on what you'd think about as cybersecurity. We were working on other sort of tracking, if you want. And we worked on other problems as well. But then towards the end of that, and back in 2007, we had just sold the other company, and I was on the treadmill, and we started talking about or thinking about, what to do next. And this idea of connecting a analytical engine, if you want, straight onto the internet hit me. Like, what about if I could actually analyze the internet in real time? That was sort of the most audacious sort of way of thinking about it. And then we started building that. It took a while before we got started, and but suddenly realized that the internet had both become this incredible sort of engine of how the world went around, but also how become the place where bad guys do stuff, be it nation states stealing secrets or cyber criminals stealing money. And we'll talk more about all the other stuff that's happening there. And it sort of turned out that if you could analyze all that nefarious activity, you could do something interesting. So, and I think I've sort of personally developed along that path. If you asked me in 2007 or 2009 what I knew about information security, it would be quite shallow. And hopefully here by 2025, I know a few things, and slowly by osmosis, I've tried to pick up a few things along the way.
Yeah, I think that I'm, when I think about Spotfire, I think about business intelligence and like marketing kind of information, and where my customers are, and getting.
We did a lot of work in those sort of things too, but we always did more work in what I would think about as the technical intelligence. And so,
sure.
So that was sort of, it was scientific data and so on. But the stuff that we never talked too much about was more in the, we'll just call it the intelligence side of things.
Right. Sure. I mean, it's hard to look at a table and make sense of it. And it's definitely hard to see like trends in information if you're just seeing like tables of data. Or even, I think that one of the things that was really neat to me many, many years ago was just like identifying what was going on in the network just by doing graph analysis, right? And so there's so many different ways of visualizing today that I don't think that we really had that many sophisticated tools. I mean, imagine R was still around then, but
that's sort of the thing is like the and it's been a long time, so I started working on this together with some great people. We, what do we want to call it, back in early 90s, and there were people back before then. Edward Tufte wrote his wonderful books on visualized data sets, and were great guys. There was a fantastic man, Bill Cleveland at AT&T, did wonderful books on the subject. And to your point, R and S and these sort of things, that was great ways of visualizing data. Now, they were always so hard to use, so that the benefit didn't come. And I think then at the same time, we've gone through a data explosion, which clearly cybersecurity have gone through as well, and especially with the sort of disparate data sets that are just very hard to deal with. And I don't want to say that data visualization is the answer to everything. I probably could rightfully be accused of having said that many times, but in reality, that's one analytical method but this idea of dealing with large data sets, and I think that's where we're going to find the answers to a lot of cybersecurity problems in the future.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. I think that the relationships between all the data is crucial, right? I mean, how you consume it may be different. It might be a visualization, it might be a table, it might be, anything, but could be a timeline. There's lots of different ways.
It might be a machine. It might be a machine doing it also. So
right.
But getting the data to the idea that we look at data versus a human looking at a single alert. That's sort of the big insight, that we need more than looking at a single alert. And
sure, yeah, for sure. And again, I think that, like you were saying, like data explosions. I think that I having done a number of incident responses on my past, and then really just kind of trying to get to the data, like making an atom of data that's useful and that could be related to something else, and that you could like put it all together. I think that's somewhat difficult for people to think about, like, what is all the things that you need to do to build a system that allows you to take atomic pieces of data and make it so it's useful to other pieces of data.
It's difficult. Right? It's very difficult. It's very difficult. And that's sort of what we've tried to do here, through painstakingly, if you want. If you think about sort of nefarious activity, there will be a threat actor, there'll be a piece of malware. Maybe it's not always a piece of malware, but it will be, let's assume for sake, and maybe there is some command and control infrastructure. Maybe there's a vulnerability involved. It's not always all of these pieces. That's part of the problem. And then on the other end, there's got to be some sort of target, whether it's a company or an organization or a human, and that target has certain infrastructure and attack surface and vulnerabilities also. So that sort of equation, you turn that, and then you say that target is in a particular geography and the threat actor is in a particular geography. And pretty quickly, you could sort of see a graph coming out of that. And so we think about that in our world as the recorded future intelligence graph, that we sort of, as we collect data from the internet, everything from what gets written down to net flow between two IP addresses, we live publish that into our blog, into our information graph, or intelligence graph that describes the world, and then we connect that to what we see on security controls. And to your point, that is that painstakingly work. Like in the new world, a human can't do that anymore. It was possible to your point earlier, but when incident was going down, you could do it historically. Maybe there's still some superhumans who can pull it off, but I think that's going to be game over soon.
Yeah, I mean, and like you were saying, I think that it's one thing doing it in an incident, and it's a small incident, and you can kind of put it together. I remember one incident that I had that we had so much data, and it was so messed up. I'll say messed up, right? Even though it had a lot of the elements, it didn't have the right timestamps. The timestamp might be in Hong Kong, and we were working out of thought we were working out of UTC, timestamps, and then we're figuring out that none of this stuff lined up, and then we're having to go reset everything. And again, I don't think that people realize that how much work is involved there. That just to like identify data sources is one thing, getting into a structure is another thing, but actually transforming it, maintaining the transformation of that data, and then doing that at the scale of the internet, and the scale of like how many places that you're probably gathering information from. that's a big operation. And then
it is, and now the beauty of it when it works can be, I think of just given that it's a lot about Iran here going on right now. I think of like 10 years ago we worked on Al-Qassam cyber fighters, which was sort of a, probably you'd call a hacktivist sort of group, but probably with some IRGC little puppeteering in the background, and then there was a series of other actors, and we did this timeline. We put the Al-Qassam cyber fighter sort of activities on a timeline. We put them next to the Iranian cyber army. We put them next to 2 or 3 other sort of Iranian groups. And then they just timelined out beautifully. And the one thing that just popped in your head when you saw it, and your eye saw it immediately, was that none of these guys are active at the same time. It sort of pops to you immediately. Oh, it's the same guy puppeteering all this stuff. These are just different handles, groupings, whatever you want, but they're never active at the same time. And when you see that in front of you, and you now realize that these 2, 3, 4, 5 set of activities is really one activity. Now, what does that mean for Defender? Some network defender is going to be like, yeah, so what? What am I just want to block the IPs. And then some other guy might be like, who's going to do something about that? So the insight can be worth different things to different people. But when you have had those sort of experiences, it's pretty hard to take it away from you.
Yeah. And like you said, I think that there's different levels of Defender, right? There's definitely strategic thinking. There's some operational and tactical kind of thinking involved as, from, how to consume threat intelligence, in an organization. I definitely would not, I guess if I was in the middle of an incident and I had to explain to, an executive what was going on, then, having some amount of technical indicators about what's going on might be useful. But honestly, I think that too much detail and too much technical IP address is really just going to go over their head, right? But showing flows and graphs like, hey, this is going on, this is their infrastructure, or they have different ways that they're trying to get to initial access, how they're saying to us. Again, this might be interesting from a storytelling perspective to an executive, but that information is really probably more useful to someone that's on the front lines. And like you said, they're looking for, how do I stop it? How do I contain it? How do I keep it off my network? How do I block it before it becomes a problem? Those are very tactical uses of threat intelligence, right? Which, again, depending on where you are in the defender hierarchy, so to speak, and who your consumer of information are, you're going to have different levels of
care. Yeah, and now there. But then the interesting thing is, like, we've seen also how people sort of getting more comfortable around these sort of things, and again, to your point, you could have sort of a right now we had somebody reached out here, literally real time, 30 minutes ago. I saw on one of the channels here, somebody's like, what do we at Recorded Future believe the impact on this Iran-Israel thing is going to be on American retail? And the simple answer is probably very low. Yeah, unless something. Now, if I was in a utility where we know that Iran has sort of done things, I would probably be lean forward and say we should keep an extra eye open. Likewise, go back to my idea of the sort of the set of actors over time there. So at some level, okay, great input. That's elegant, but what do I actually do with that? If I'm going to go hunt for these things, knowing that these set of things are more or less the same, now being able to say, oh, these guys use this tool set here, but that means I'm probably going to sort of look across all of them and understand their full set of tool sets. So I go hunt for all of it. And there are these sort of questions that I can start asking, or not just questions, but actually actions that can come out of this that really changes when I start getting a little bit of that fuller picture. And it doesn't need to be that I'm Jack Ryan at the CIA's type thing to do this. It can be quite meaningful anyway.
No, absolutely. I think even kind of understanding what it is that a threat actor is doing, or what tools they use, or how they express themselves, can help you figure out whether or not are we dealing with the same actor? Right. And this is more like, again, kind of like a incident response, maybe even SOC have these kind of uses where they might want to know, well, what's likely to happen next, right? And if you have some idea of who the what the attribution of that actor is, then you can kind of say, hey, are we seeing these kinds of tool sets or whatever? Or if you're seeing, for example, I know that we used to do this in incidents, is try to figure out who it is based on when they were active on the network. And what I mean is, like, are they working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday?
Pattern of life type analysis.
Yeah, pattern of life. They take all the Chinese holidays off. Then you can start.
No, it's and all of that we learned all that to some degree from the chasing terrorists and phone down, phone up type thing, when they're going to bed and getting up in the morning and where they are. And it's sort of applied to the same sort of thing in network data. I think the other sort of, it's I like to sort of be simplistic sometimes about this stuff and say, so put the term threat intelligence a little bit to a side, and you just say, what's the biggest indication that I'm going to have a break-in into my own house? It's that there's a break-in in my neighbor's house.
Sure.
And so now the problem with the internet is, of course, that, the guy in New Zealand is as much of my neighbor as my guy down the street. But now my neighbor is actually more importantly, the guy with the same locks. Do I have the same firewall? Do I have the same this? Do I have the same supplier? Do I have the same? So now suddenly, so right now, a lot of people are worried in the insurance industry because scattered spiders seem to have just shown up and have figured out some playbook, these kids on the whatever channel staying out at, and they've learned some of the how to go at the call centers, at the insurance providers. It's probably the same call centers serving all these guys.
Absolutely.
And then they use that to get in. And it's so that idea of my neighbor, I think that's a pretty powerful way of thinking about why intelligence can be so powerful. And it's just the concept of a neighbor is a little bit different on the internet.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that a little bit, because I think this kind of goes into that idea of a couple of things that we're kind of touching on. One is strategic intelligence, right? Who am I? What is it? What about me is interesting, right? What is it that I have that some actor might want, right? And figuring out the geopolitics of it as well, right? Because it's not always about just that you're in this industry or that industry. It's also who you represent with respect to your value as a geopolitical target, so to speak. Or even you might be a multinational corporation that does work in China, does work in Russia, does work in the UK, does work in the US. And then, just geopolitics may play into what your future plans are going to be, but also has a lot to do with, how you're going to be targeted and what you're going to be targeted about, who you are, right? Even though we're talking about neighbors, we're not, like you said, we're not talking about you're in the building next to me, right? We're talking about you fit a profile that is, the same as the other people in my neighborhood or the adjacent neighborhood, with respect to industries and what value proposition that you have to those.
Yeah. And then from that, you quickly, so if you're in defense, that there's can be people who wake up outside Beijing or outside Shanghai in sort of the Chinese defense industrial base who have been asked to sort of, or whether it's MSS or PLA, people who've sort of been tasked with nothing else but, get into your company and happily wait 3 years for that door to open up, sort of thing, versus some cyber criminals, whether that's sort of the scattered spider types or the Russian criminals, they'll pretty quickly move on. If they see your door is locked, they'll be like, no luck, move on to the next one. And there are plenty of doors to knock on. So that profiling that you're talking about is interesting, both from, sort of who am I and who do I need to look for to see what can I learn from the other guy's incident is my intelligence, or, just even how I profile myself. So it's, but you're right on.
Yeah, I was thinking, as you were saying, I was thinking about one of the briefings that I got from your team members on, China-India relationships and how that plays into the geopolitics of it. Right now, we're talking, right now, the big thing in the news today and, June 17th is, Iran, Israel, we've already had an impact on, I think, on retail in particular, with just the Houthis making the Red Sea difficult to traverse. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really, I don't know if I think that by now, I think most people have kind of absorbed the costs associated with that. But I think retailers are suffering. A lot of business consumer companies are suffering because of just the increase in supply chain costs and
that's a good example where I think people many times may not think about the second order implications. And we try to encourage people really to this. Like, what are the second order implications of, because if, again, go back to the retailer in the Midwest somewhere and you ask him, should I worry about, Israel and the United States and Israel and Central Command battling it out with a bunch of Houthis, not to sound diminishing, but
yeah.
I guess I did. But and most people would intuitively say absolutely not. But to your point, yes, and second order implications are hard.
Yeah, but I think that to what you were saying is like this current conflict between Israel and Iran. It's interesting to see that the actors that you would have expected to kind of rally to Iran's defense have already been removed, right? They were, removed from being a significant threat, I think, to Israel at this point, but also helping Iran. So, I mean, just moving into what is it that Iran can do next? I think that's an interesting question. Like right now, Houthis kind of been sidelined at this point. Whatever damage they had to the retail chain has happened and is now kind of been suppressed. The next things that are happening with Iran are going to be something different, right? I mean, Iran's not going to be able to march their army, I don't think, over to Israel. So they're going to have to kind of think of, we're seeing the drones and the missiles kind of go over. But I think on the cyber front, I'm expecting to see more activity.
That at least I think you're right that not only Houthis but their allies or proxies, if you want, in whether it's Hezbollah. Clearly Hezbollah is sort of non-existent is a strong term, but the top 20 people are gone. Most of the leadership of Hamas is gone, and Syria is obviously in a whole different. It's like nobody would have guessed what it was happening in Syria. So Iran is pretty lonely, and IRGC leadership is gone too, and Quds Force. But to your point, so it's cyber might be one of the last ways they could leash out whether they will or not. But if you're just counting, like they're not going to send an atomic bomb on us. They're not going to. There's a lot of things they're not going to do. But cyber might be one of those last things that maybe we shouldn't be terrified, but we should certainly be on the lookout.
Absolutely. Any advice what should we
I think, look, there's a set of, of course, I would recommend that people read the best intelligence on this. We'd like to think that we could do a good job here at Recorded Future. If you have another intel provider, read what you get from them. I would, so make sure that you understand, both what the sort of the methods, TTPs they use, what vulnerabilities they've been taking advantage of recently. If you are getting some sort of feed on Iranian indicators, make sure that those are up to date in your controls. Really, just ask your team to systematically go through that and make sure that everything is up to date. Some of it is easy, some of that ends up being harder. If you have more resources, maybe you actually do specific threat hunts for those TTPs that you may worry about. So I think sort of be as specific vis-a-vis the set of resources you have. If you have none of these resources, maybe there's nothing you can do. If you're a big bank or a big financial or a big tech company, you probably have some of those resources. So I would ask to sort of soup to nuts go through and do that, because Iran here, at the end of it, if this is the end of the Iranian regime and they sort of do things in a panicky way, they're not going to be very selective about their choices or targeting. So weird things could happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just going back to my experience, working in the military, I remember in 2012, Iran was on our network for like 4 months before we kind of figured it out, but we eventually figured it out and then had to extract them. I happened to be in Bahrain at the time, so it wasn't on the network that I was on, but it wasn't a connected network. I remember us trying to make decisions about, do we disconnect from the main Navy networks, or do we stay connected, or how is it that we're going to if we're going to disconnect, what would those disconnects look like? So I mean, it's thinking about what the impact could to your organization may be. But again, it's like looking at the research, looking at the indicators of compromise, indicators of an attack, figuring out, are they on your network or not on your network, or if they have something of interest to you. There's a lot of good material that's out there that you can use to kind of shore up your environment so that you're not taken by surprise, right? I mean, again, a lot of these actors, especially nation states, if they're going to get into a critical infrastructure, they may have set up a foothold a long time ago and just really kind of like, now's the time to kind of figure out like, hey, how
I don't know if they're going to use it. The other things I would worry about is, so interesting enough, Iran has had a lot of cyber problems associated things, whether it's sort of disinformation, and they literally, I think, have sort of believed in the idea of building a cyber capability for warfare. And they have been probing our critical infrastructure. They have been doing a lot of things. Now, it is as much as we would like to, accuse them of being reckless, in some ways, it still has been controlled. It's being controlled by our GC, controlled by. So now you think about it in Iran, that goes into another set of environment, where things goes from economically, from an Iranian perspective, goes from bad to worse. Now you're going to have these, whether they're kids or middle-aged men or, ancient as myself, you're not going to have people who, may totally lose economic opportunity. So now maybe some of these people with competences are going to have to get into cybercrime in a way that, that we may not have seen, before. That may not happen tomorrow, but over the next year or two, that could actually be quite a scenario that I would be worried about. So I think, again, those sort of secondary effects is where we should be thinking about an open mind. I think about a report we did about a year ago. Again, I don't think that was published publicly, but deep report on the sort of the hang-around actors, if you want, or the contractors in the cyber world around Iranian governing cyber actors. And if those guys go wild, all kinds of interesting things could happen.
Basically, you're saying that whoever is maintaining control of the people today, if those go away, what happens next? Again, I often think of, or when I explain to people like, hey, how do I think about threat intelligence? It's like, you got to realize there's someone on the other side that, has a job or has, responsibilities, has rent to pay, has, needs to, eat, right?
Yeah.
It's like those things, and that these people are going to use their skills in a way that it benefits them. Sometimes it's an organized way, sometimes it's unorganized. It just depends on what it is that they can take advantage of. So if the regime does change, it's like, wait, now we have a whole new set of actors that are out there that are looking to
eat, looking to eat,
take care of their own, right?
It's hard to hold it against them, sort of thing. So
no, absolutely. I definitely wouldn't hold it against them. It's just, again, people want to survive, and as long as you understand that they want to survive and that they have different ways, just like we do on the defense side, we want to survive as well. How do we go about it? Many different ways. So it's a very interesting change that may be occurring here. Right. But let's go back. Let's go back to like, when you started Recorded Future in 2009, I remember threat intelligence back then, that I was consuming, on a military network. We definitely had indicators and those kinds of things that were being fed to us, seemed to be mostly generated internally. And then some of it came externally. They were somewhat few and far between. I feel like we got a lot of information from open source kind of places that we would feed into our IPSs or whatever it is that we had at the time. But it was kind of a different world back then too. It was really like data centers. We had our own data centers. We stood up our own servers. We had our own builds of our desktops and laptops that we had VPNs to get back into the network, and it felt like a very closed kind of right. And then, you kind of move through, and in 2009, the cloud was in full swing. It was several years into it probably, but I remember back in the time, it felt like more of lift and shift. People were just kind of using them like data centers, but they were lift and shift. And now we've kind of come into this world where everything's being delivered via SaaS. Kind of thinking it from that point of view, do you feel like there's more information now than there was in 2009? But has the quality of the information changed? Volumes changed? How's the quality been? Has it been better?
That's a good question. I think, so clearly a lot of stuff is, to your point, is on the internet, whatever you want to call it. I always like to say here at Recorded Future, we basically have 0 servers. Now we have big setup at AWS that but we own 0 servers. We rent capacity and all kinds of different things. So a lot of stuff might be in the cloud, whether it's running Salesforce or this and that. And so, if you take that part where you just have all these things that are out there, knowing where things are and knowing how it all connects. If you take the Rob Joyce comment from 5-6 years ago, it would like know your network better than your adversary. It certainly feels like that's harder than ever. And so there's no panacea in all of that. And even if you don't own the servers, you still need to maintain it and run it, and you need to sort of make sure that between all the cloud SaaS stuff you're describing and then the stuff that you still run and control yourself, it's your job to make sure that all of that is secure. And I think the reason these guys, the scatter spider type guys, have figured that out, it's that they just sit there together in some chat room and cooks up like, where's there's a weak link, where's there link, and whether that's a sort of a data center in the Philippines, or a call center, outsourced call center is in the Philippines or whatever, they always find the weakest link, or not even the weakest link. They find a weak link. Yeah. So I think there's every opportunity for building great data out of that. We obviously are trying. The good news from a intelligence collection point of view is that it's actually easier for us to build data out of what we can see on the internet. We now, on the other end, as I mentioned, we hook up to the controls as well and bring that anonymously into our data set, or anonymized or non-attributable into the data set. But so I think you can build much better intelligence now than you could in 2009. That doesn't mean that it's automatically great. Whether it's a high value, high production rate sort of piece of written intel, a one pager that really in an actionable way captures exactly what matters regarding a particular event, or if it's a high quality set of data, that takes work. Nothing comes for free, and the expectations just get higher and higher. I think is sort of now obviously with AI, a lot of that changes again. I just had a great conversation with our head of Intel here earlier today, and we talked about how maybe a lot of this is going to change from the people who write reports are going to write agents. They're going to, instead of writing an Iran report, you're going to write a great agent that's going to be meaningful for the next 6 months on understanding the Iran threat. So it's not easy out there for doing this stuff, but it's pretty cool what you can do.
Yeah, I was going to say that going back to the scattered spider and the outsourced call centers, in SaaS environments, right? It's it felt like it was a few weeks ago, Coinbase had an attack against them where they had like an SEC filing, and I felt like that was kind of interesting because when I did a little bit of open source intelligence gathering on my own, went to see what kind of people they're hiring, what kind of technology they were using. It felt like their infrastructure that they had for their call centers were like AWS Connect, Salesforce, Jira. They had a lot of open, a lot of SaaS products that are part of their chain. And I think that over the years, I remember when we used to set up, systems for outsourced call centers, we would do VDI and have applications. We'd have SAP inside. We'd have that all kind of closed up, and we'd have Citrix or something else in front of it, where we thought we were insulating it, having it in a closed environment. But I think that was true for the most part. I think that system actually worked out pretty well. But now so many services are being delivered via SaaS. So through SaaS products, I think it's just harder to kind of figure out, like, hey, how to defend it and what your controls are.
And it's not, like first the actual system, but then the other party's call center, and
Yes.
the call center of the call center, like and again, when it's one thing that it's really, there's like 1,000 kids. They're like, that's why I don't. In some cases, the name of a threat actor can be very effective. It's like it's sort of what we call Blue Delta, or Blue Bravo, or Red Charlie, or Red, like whatever now may be, these that are fairly well defined, time bound, decent to some degree perhaps, but decently bound threat actors. The idea of scattered spider makes it sound like three guys and a dog sort of thing, but it's sort of a network of people that, at least from what I can understand, is spans English speaking countries, but with incredible connections into Russian communities and others, and to call that a name is probably just wrong, because the ability for this network of people to sort of then backdoor their way via social engineering techniques is pretty astounding.
Yeah. So because I was kind of just thinking that a lot of my brain power right now is just focused on like SaaS attacks against identity, where we're storing data, in the cloud, and how to protect it. I'm on the defender side. I'm a consumer of threat intelligence, but I feel like it's like I was just reading another article by your, Insight Group about traffic distribution systems, right? TDS tag 124 or something like that, where they're, targeting people that are going to websites and then just redirecting them based on, what kind of, what their IP address is or some other information that might be useful to that actor, and then getting them to places and just compromising WordPress, sites. It's just this big engine of activity that everyone's doing. And it seems like so much of this is happening across, browsers and, through web servers and compromised web servers and everything else. And then where your data is. And
and with high degree of specialization. I like to say this point that, Adam Smith, as the inventor of modern economics, would be, even though he's not so modern anymore, but he would be very proud of the initial access brokers or what have you, with the high degree of specialization that also allows them to be very good at that. And that means that this guy who then just figures out very niche pieces, and then somebody can string that together and orchestrate that into an attack, it doesn't mean that it's easy by any means to do this stuff. So
yeah, but like you were saying, I think we're on two sides of an economy, right? There's that economy that we're participating in, where we're on the defense side, working with corporations and governments to kind of learn how to defend, or teach people how to defend, or provide information for how to defend. But then the other side of it is the economy of criminal organizations or espionage or whatever. I think
it's sort of an interesting world in that of sort of a convergence. That's convergence, a little bit of fluffy term, but there's sort of some kind of convergence here between what you think about cyber activity here, cyber crime, and then the world of fraud that is coming together in very interesting fashions, and just understanding how that they have so our new owners here at Recorded Future, Mastercard, they have some slide that they like to show, which starts with like rank orders the world economies, and first the United States, boom. Second, China, boom. We can even probably argue about that, but U.S., China, and then the third is fraud. and it's like an enormous economy, and then in that, this convergence between cyber and fraud is just very I don't want to say compelling, but it's certainly interesting.
Well, I think that you were just talking about that. When I was at Expedia, even though I had all of cyber, at Expedia, the one thing that I did have to do is fraud recovery, right? It's like whenever we did have a big incident that had to do with fraud, I had to go help try to figure out how do we claw this money back from some bank in Turkey that was having some, somehow get the money back, right? And I think that it was surprising to me. Well, anytime you're a tech company that's selling things online, the information, the likelihood that the attack is the fraud's going to happen and it's also a cyber attack is very, very close, right? It's very much the same game. From my perspective, I'm sure, someone that's deep into fraud, they would say it's more nuanced than that. But from my perspective, it was very much how do I find these indicators? How do I use those so I can defend better, right? Or at least identify when some attack was happening that was going to result in fraud, or whether it's account takeover or people reusing credit cards, et cetera. I think there's.
I think the thing that strikes me is how these fraud guys are. They have deep understanding of how to mess with humans. Cyber guys have deep understanding typically in how to mess with computers. And, some of the best cyber guys that, sort of hackers that you meet are actually pretty good social engineers at the same time. And if they have both those skills, they can manipulate their way. But if you have the pure fraud guys who are sort of like even better at that, they do all this stuff without even. They certainly don't think in malware terms. So when you have these two worlds meet, there's pretty interesting things that happen.
Yes, I agree. I mean, so I definitely can feel how technologies and indicators and how actors think and such are going to be useful to Mastercard. I think it's good.
No, and there are no easy answers. But what's been cool, is that so we've already had a couple of breakthroughs. It's a little bit too early to talk about it, but this idea of the cyber flow of data together with the money flow of data. The one example I will use is to say we have the largest collection of stolen credit cards here in the world. Millions, hundreds of millions, actually, even high hundreds of millions of stolen credit cards. You go like, how can there be that many? But even at Expedia, you probably just saw an onslaught of credit cards. And so we have that, but we never knew whether here on standalone, we never knew whether a card had actually been used or not. But now we can know that. So now, we get these cards from all kinds of wonderful places in the world. And some of them show up from Bob and some from Joe and from some Sally and some from Maria. Now I can actually know, Maria is pushing really good products. Whereas, Bob, he has crappy products. And once I know that, I can actually start aggregating that. And we can't know anything about the individual transactions, but we can know something about how to risk score the bad guys. And now I can actually tell Expedia, or, just to use a random example, you used it, but I could tell anybody to then that cards coming from Maria, those are the ones you really should worry about versus the cards coming from Bobby, whatever sort of thing. I'm vastly simplifying, but you get the point.
Totally. I mean, I think that I think that, in my bank days, I remember using a threat aggregator to kind of bring all threat intelligence together. And I remember that at the time, threat intelligence was just lots of indicators, right? And there was some information about how they were used and such. But I remember that when we just started, hooking it into our system without any kind of prioritization or understanding of how those indicators were used, that we had so many false positives, right? And so much work that was being done at the SOC that really just, wasted people's times, right? Because it was just the wrong thing at the wrong time. So having some idea that this is a high value indicator that's being used in such a way, I mean, anything that can help us prioritize what work goes to a human, I think is going to help. Yeah. But especially on the fraud side, like you said, it was like third biggest economy in the world is, cybercrime or fraud.
Fraud is sort of so cybercrime would be part of that. Right. It actually turns out that fraud money, the other, that because you come home from Southeast Asia here, the Singaporean government is just arguably terrified of what's going on with the call centers in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and so on, who are, defrauding people at mass
Yep.
scale, and
Yep.
what do they call the whole pig butchering type of stuff, and that you wouldn't call that cyber, but it's pretty damn effective.
Right. Yeah, I think there's so many gaps. There's so many gaps to cover. There's so much work to do. Right. So, we talked a little bit about strategic. We talked a lot about like indicators and how to prioritize indicators. I guess we talked a little bit about, often disconnect between technical teams who understand the threats, like they're actually seeing them every single day and seeing what's happening, and executives that need to allocate resources and make strategic decisions. Mm-hmm. Right. There's definitely two parts of it. Well, these are two ends, right? Of a spectrum. How do we bridge that gap? How do we bridge the gap between an executive that needs to make strategic decisions and then the disconnect with the technical teams who really understand the threats? Is there something we could be doing to bridge that gap better?
I think there's certainly an element that I'll think about it from what we need to do at Recorded Future, but then maybe we can talk about what needs to happen inside a company as well. And the beauty of that is that information can be a bridge. Like we had from a large Saudi customer. This is a story from like so long ago, but somebody from Saudi, he said Recorded Future is like the honey and the honeycomb that is sort of connecting the dots. He had like a whole sort of thing like that. And it was like that the information that bridges between the different pieces. And he was probably thinking more between security controls and, I see this indicator over here and I see it over here. That's pretty telling. I need to connect the dots here. And I think that's, as we talked about the graph, and, few executives want to hear about an IP address, but they probably would like to hear, what does that IP address relate to? Is it owned by a particular company? Is it related to a geography? Is it related to a threat actor? And, so first of all, obviously know when you produce intelligence or an IR brief or whatever that may be, produce it so that it maps to the audience, and whereas the technical person wants to hear what's technical, they want to know what happened, versus the exec very likely want to know the so what in CIA language or second order implication in some other language. I like the so what is sort of a little bit of a abrasive way of saying it. When you do the PDB, you're not going to show up at the PDB and say this tank moved 200 yards. You're going to say, what does it mean that this tank moved 200 yards here? And so what? So I think that's the sort of piece. And if you do that really well, and you actually ground you have the same data points that yields these two information products, and actually have glue between them, now you actually have a chance to sort of bridge those pieces. Now, you don't know if you're going to be in the room with both those audiences at the same time, or are they going to be sort of briefed at the same time? I think we have to be prepared for a world where a portion of this stuff is also just going to be consumed by an AI engine, but it's, or an AI, whatever, an algorithm. But that also needs to be getting the information that is meaningful. So I think that if we're good about this and having the same sort of information foundation, the same information holdings that sort of underpin this, but knowing how we produce it and do that well, then I think I have a great shot at this. If we sort of come in and talk business fluff with the exec and drown in tables of data to the technical guy, and then we're not helping.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that someone that's making a decision about how to allocate resources, you're a CEO, you do this all the time. You're in the unfortunate position of understanding data, how data is used and everything else, and understand your threats. And imagine Recorded Future is threatened all the time. I mean, no one would. I think there's so many actors that would love to say they breached Recorded Future, right? And did something, honorary to you guys. So
I hope not.
Yeah, that would be bad. But I think that bringing a bunch of technical jargon and such to an executive, I don't know if that's too much help, right?
No, it's not.
And how to use, the data, that the technical teams probably want to have. There has to be a bridge. I mean, I remember, in incidents, that I used to be on, we used to have a business bridge and a technical bridge, right? And we had someone that went from the technical bridge to the business bridge and would brief the executives on what was going on in an incident, right? And then the business people would be asking, so what? What's the impact? Is this what's the impact right now? But again, to your point, what's the secondary impacts? What else is going to happen, right?
Yeah.
We're going to be talking to lawyers for 2 years about this, right? And then they'd go back and that guy would have to go back to the technical team and ask them questions. And there was this guy that's just sitting there like trying to interpret both.
And it's hard because in some cases this is where it gets difficult because few people are able to do all of this.
Right.
Like that's where there are obviously we've all worked for those guys who have the full spectrum. They're in the NetFlow records. They're in the deepest and connected back to like political implications down the line 2 years, and that's very few. And to be honest, most people who actually do that, they'll make it up sort of things. I'd be even careful to they exist for sure, but few people can do that. And I think to some degree that's part of the role of the CISO of Absolutely. First of all be that bridge themselves, but then systematizing this. So if there is a template for how we report on things, make sure that template both provides room for sound technical stuff at the right abstraction level, but also just try to answer, here are the so what's that we actually have an indication of, or that we actually have a sense of. Maybe the so what's that we don't know what the implications are around these. And maybe that's when you sort of invite the exec to be, this is not a technical know-it-all guy who's going to claim that he has all the answers. He's actually trying to draw me in. And that's a good way of get some more resources. That's another thing. So I think, the good CISO is probably going to be great at doing some of that bridging, but also through templates and training and so on can help their teams to grow in these directions.
Well, I mean, I think part of the issue is that the CISO doesn't get to see all risks, right? And all potential impacts to the business, right? They kind of, from my experience, and maybe it's just me, but I always feel like I've been very concentrated on the technology and the impact of technology on the organization. That doesn't really help with other kinds of risks like geopolitical risk or fraud or physical security kind of risks. I mean, I've definitely had that kind of opportunities in the past as well, but I think most CISOs are probably in, dealing with a technical realm, but there are much more I think conversations about how the technology could be impacted, but I think there's a lot more things that impact a business. Like we were talking about supply chain risks and stuff like that, and the implication of geopolitics on or war in a region. How does that translate to the business? All of a sudden, technology risk kind of starts going down. Lower, right? But being able to bridge, like, what is it? Understanding the strategic intent of the business, what they're trying to do, how does that impact their technology strategy? How does that impact their cyber strategy? I think those things are important. Coming from a CISO going, down to the technical team.
And I think this is where a good CISO also have some of these discussions before the incidents comes.
Absolutely.
To sort of have that discussion and understand from the key. I'm not a big fan of the word stakeholders, but I guess in this case, it actually does fit the bill. And so go talk to those stakeholders and say, look, one day we might very well have an incident, and what's going to be important to you at that time? And, what's the stuff that you think about? And what are the things that are gaps for you? And happy to sort of run a mock incident in advance. And there's so many things that I think CISOs don't do that can really prepare for that bad day without getting too dramatic about it.
Absolutely. So Recorded Future makes the invisible visible and shifts cybersecurity from reactive to predictive. But since new threats emerge every day, is predictive threat intelligence more of a luxury for organizations that are struggling with firefighting?
I think that, so here's a couple of thoughts. First of all, by having the name of the company be, Recorded Future, you sort of, you set your own trap or we set our own trap, and people expect it to be sort of predictions out of the sky sort of thing. But I think that's a little bit so audacious that people get it, that it's not that easy. I think that's number one. Number two, very few attacks, very few events in the world are complete unknowns. They do happen. I think, our dear Russians, when they sort of a couple of weeks ago suddenly realized that Ukrainian trucks were parked next to their air bases, thousands of kilometers away in Siberia, flying cheapo DJI drones, straight, over the fence and onto their airplanes. That probably felt like an unknown. And could they prepared for that? Yeah, maybe they could have, but there are those sort of the unknown type of attacks. But again, very few things are truly unknown. So I think really our sort of idea here is that observe the world at every level. Observe what's happening to the neighbors. That's sort of the most simple sort of thing, all the way down to observe what happens in the net flows. And if I see that this one set of command and control infrastructure run by a certain Chinese threat actor is having these sort of things happening to it, and it's happening to this company, it's happening to this company. Now the odds that it's happening to this company is going up. And I'm using very simple analogies here, but
no, it's good.
So, and the idea is also you flipped a coin and you say, okay, so let's assume that you didn't get to use this in advance and something did happen to you. Now, I still think you will want to do, some level of analysis. Some people will tell you that they want to try to figure out who it was. They want to be able to go to law enforcement and say, we believe this was XYZ, and we want to do something about that. Some other ones are going to say, I don't care at all about who it was, but I still want to care about sort of what TTP was used. So I can go look for, other sort of indicators of the same still flourishing around on my network. I want to sort of take that apart. So that I may consider true sort of strategic intelligence being sort of a luxury, but being able to, with efficiency, clean up after an incident and be prepared to do so, I don't think that's a luxury at all. Mm-hmm. So no, I obviously, I'm not very objective in all of this, but we think this is not a luxury at all. And I think there's a lot of day-to-day sort of benefits coming out of good intelligence.
No, I think so too. I think you kind of nailed it. I think that as defenders, we often think that we're under-resourced. We're dealing with way more attacks than we have people to defend against, right? But I think that if you went on the other side and you said the attacker side, right? The attacker side are also dependent on humans to get the work done, right? And they're also constrained by resources as well.
Very much so, yeah.
And so the idea that, it's like, what's happening to my neighbor, right? It's like, what's happening around me? And maybe they had a slightly different infrastructure than you did. Maybe they had a slower patch cycle than you did this time, right? But if you're using this kind of equipment, that kind of equipment, you're in this industry, you're a target, you have the same kind of potential, they could live off the land in your environment the same as they lived on the other environment, then you may not be in their sites right now, or maybe you are in their sites, but right now they're working on this problem. They're working on this environment, this target.
Yeah, target space. I think that's what these guys do. They scan the world. They scan, and especially we're talking about the criminals here.
Yes,
they'll keep scanning the world, and they have a pattern of things that they're trying to go after, and they'll sort of look for the quote unquote easiest targets. They cross-reference that with Zoom info information and the like, so they find the targets that actually or have likelihood of pay. Yep. They know from their own experience that if they can get a law firm to pay, if they can get a insurance company to pay, if they can get a retailer to pay, people from they don't need to be geniuses. If they have sort of can use Zoom info plus sort of like their own experiences to go down that and combine that with their technical scanning, they can, basically combine the drone with a Hellfire missile, if you use the back to, and then and there are plenty of IP addresses to scan for, so they have plenty of targets, and they make sure they don't do it in Russia or ex-CIS states. And the playbook is pretty straightforward. It's you don't want to say it's easy, because it's not easy for them, but it's, and when they then figure out that they can actually outsource this via sort of a whatever you call it, Russian Krisha model, it's pretty amazing. It's one of the best business models ever invented.
Right. But again, it's like right now you may not be their target because they're working on something right now, but any information that you can get where you can get ahead of that actor so that you can get defend yourself better is worthwhile. It's not a luxury. It is something you should be doing. Right. It may be slower or faster depending on what resources you have. But, if you have information, how you using that information to benefit your organization is the thing to do, I would say. Right. So we talked a lot about threat intelligence. We talked about strategic threat intelligence. We talked about, tactical, operational. We've talked about like prioritization. We talked about a lot of stuff about how to defend and how to use information to defend well. So if there was one piece of advice you'd give a CISO who wants to future-proof their security program, what should they be investing in now that might not seem obvious?
I think there are sort of two different. First of all, I've never been a CISO, so just but I've obviously met thousands of CISOs, it feels like, and dealt with a lot of these sort of things. I think there's two different scenarios. One is somebody who, and this is, I think, the most common scenario, somebody comes into a program and either the last guy got sort of pushed out or the last guy sort of moved on, got recruited to go elsewhere, but nonetheless, you're sort of inheriting somebody else's mess. Mm-hmm. Or you're sort of I met a CISO this morning here of a, very cool startup, with an incredibly high threat profile here with basically infinite budget. When you hear that sort of thing, and that's cool. That guy at some level can build something very neat. He can sort of go at the sort of understand, how he build it very fresh and build it very elegantly and separate it and, be architecturally clean. I'm a software guy, a computer scientist by background. So I always like to think about build things that are very clean. This, so you really understand, you want to build this set of controls and what things do what and how do you actually collect the data in a very clean, organized fashion. Basically the way I described the graph before, but how do I do that on the internal side? The hard part is, of course, how do you recommend or how do you coach somebody to do that when they walk into somebody else's mess that is a 40, 50-year-old company that have, done 6 M&A or 60 M&A type things along the way. It's very, very, very hard. It's practically impossible to have great advice in that sort of thing. I think we are going to end up in a world where a lot of things are becoming software defined, like the idea of the software defined network, the software defined sort of thing. So defining things in software and abstractions, I would, I don't know if that's real good advice for somebody, but I think it is. The sort of things that allows me to sort of up level my instead of thinking about, that I have this firewall or this thing on the AV on this box sort of thing, allow me to abstract so I can use that. I would certainly think about it as maybe the key way of future-proofing my world, where I understand that, a software definition of what my world is and make sure that I can collect the data in that. But again, I don't know, for the guy who walks into a 40, 50-year-old sort of company with a whole bunch of M&A behind it and that has never been cleaned up, it's a little bit beyond me, I must say. I want to be humble and not throw out simplistic advice.
So no, there's no one good piece of advice for that guy.
No, of course, I'm Recorded Future. I'm going to say get a lot of intelligence, and like what we would say from a Recorded Future point of view, we would say take the existing controls, being them ancient or brand new, and hook them up via our collective insight and cross correlate that in real time with our intelligence, and you're going to get a great integrated view across all of this in real time, and that's going to help you. And I think that's going to help you, but it's not going to be, getting, to modernize my world in a world where I don't necessarily just end up on one single vendor, which is, because that's the nasty part about security. If I end up on just one single vendor, I can end up with all kinds of other problems from that. So the life of a CISO is not easy.
Yeah, I would say, having been in that job where I inherited
somebody else's mess. Yeah.
A 20-year-old company with 200 brands that were, put together by M&A. That's a difficult situation, right? You're having so many technology stacks to defend, right? But again, even in the best of intentions, there's companies that just go, they just might have a couple of architectures for 100 different business units, right? Yeah. I mean, when it's all said and done, it's not as complicated. It's complicated, right? But I think you're right. I think it is about patterns. It's like understanding there are often a set of basic patterns that are there, and there's basic defense capabilities that you can put around it. But it really comes down to, I think, prioritizing the work, right? What's most likely to get you, and then work on making sure that you have the visibility, you understand what it is that you're defending. You understand who might be acting against you. And then, kind of moving down that way of like making sure that your crown jewels that are going to cause the most threat to the business, whether it's cash flow impacting or, some sort
I think that's the point, that being ruthless on our prioritization. So understanding the set of threats, understanding the set of vulnerabilities, and understanding, the timeline of your business. Here is where, you may think of yourself that you're going to be the CISO for the next 20 years, but in reality, the world, you might be in a private equity backed company that has sort of a 3-year cycle to things. And in 3 years, the whole team is going to be different, including yourself. So they want you to sort of accomplish a certain. So no, but I think it actually makes sense that come up with the ruthless sort of prioritization from an information security point of view, but align that with the how much do they want to how much does your boss, the CEO, want to renovate the house over the next 3 years? Because if nobody wants you to have a half renovated house in 3 years. Better be very good at a few things. Yeah,
that's the bathroom. We're just going to.
Yeah, maybe that's the answer.
Maybe it's the answer.
Yeah.
Well, Christopher, it was great having you on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. And
thank you. This was great fun. Thank you.
Much.